Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm bringing you guys a brand new catch-up review segment where I talk about several albums and projects released earlier this year that for one reason or another I didn't have a chance to talk about in full when they initially dropped. 4 projects I want to talk about here today. The first one of these catch-up videos for 2020. Let's get right into things with the new Blood In, Blood Out mix from Denzel Curry that dropped back earlier in January. And this is kind of odd considering I actually talked about Denzel Curry's album Unlocked with Kenny Beats that dropped a few weeks back before talking about this project, even though this project dropped before that album dropped. But whatever, I guess. We're talking about this project here and now. It's a bit shorter, more like an EP in terms of length, though it's technically just a mix. And overall, I think this is a really good release. I don't think it's one of Denzel Curry's best projects overall necessarily, but it still has a lot of what I really like in his music compacted into this really short runtime. The instrumentals here on this thing are really hard-hitting, they're really dark, they have that nice southern trap sound that I think Denzel does really nicely. The rapping here on this project is fantastic too, very ferocious, very energetic, it pairs up with the instrumentals here perfectly. A lot of the features do a good job with their parts on this thing as well, whether it be with rapping, some of the verses, or some of the catchy hooks on this thing too. As far as like the lyrics go on this project, I wouldn't necessarily say that they're the greatest, most deepest thing in the world necessarily. However, for this kind of project, for its runtime and things of that sort, I think the lyrics on this thing work fine enough. There's enough clever bars packed into this thing, enough, nice references, things of that sort, in order to keep this project interesting from a lyrical standpoint, even if it's not, super deep or anything quite like that. I also really like the way this project flows together as well. Given the mix format of this thing, a lot of the tracks just kind of bleed together in a way that I think leads to it being a very cohesive listen overall, but not to the point where this starts to feel like this very lengthy but messy track. Every segment of this thing is still really unique in its own right, and they all stand out from each other, even if they flow together in a way that makes listening to this thing as a whole, as opposed to, just a bunch of little individual tracks, more fulfilling. Overall, this is a pretty great project. I don't think, again, that it's one of the most groundbreaking that come from Denzel Curry, but he does a lot on this thing that I really enjoy. It's got the flows from him that I like, enough clever bars packed into this thing to keep me entertained. The production here is nice too, and given the format of this thing, it stands out as being somewhat unique in his discography of projects, even though he does have other short-length projects out there, including the other album he just dropped earlier this year. This is a pretty unique addition to his catalog, even though stylistically it's pretty much him just doing stuff that he's done before, just at a really high level. If you're a fan of him and his music, I think you'll certainly like this project too. If for whatever reason you just didn't get around to listening to it because it wasn't like an album and it was just uploaded to his YouTube, I highly recommend that you give this thing a listen. You'll certainly enjoy it. Overall, a really great project. Moving on though, let's talk about the new posthumous album from Mac Miller, Circles. Now, I should say, before talking about this record, that this was the first Mac Miller record that I listened to in full. Of course, I was aware of him and his music prior to his passing back in 2018. I had heard some of his biggest tracks, and heard some features from him as well, but I never got around to actually listening to an album from him or a mixtape from him in full. But with the release of this album here, and with the reception to it being pretty positive, I decided to check it out and see what was going on here on this release. And overall, this is a pretty good record, and probably one of the better posthumous releases that I've seen in quite a while. I know lots of people have been talking about posthumous releases recently, especially with us getting quite a good amount of them in the past few years, and especially considering how low quality a lot of them have been, this one stands out as being a really solid one through and through. It seems like the people behind this release put a lot of effort into making it actually work as an album and actually having a consistent theme and sound to this thing. It doesn't feel like a bunch of odds and ends being like tied together here on this release just to steal some money from some fans who will really just buy anything from an artist they love. Instead, it feels like a really nice collection of tracks that honestly would have sounded really nice even if Mac Miller was still alive when this thing released. Stylistically, this record sees Miller going for this more laid back, R&B type sound. There are a few cuts on this thing where he is rapping, but for the most part, the more soulful approach to a lot of the tracks here is what dominates the sound of this project, and I think it works out pretty nicely. I especially feel like the run of tracks towards the very start of this project is one that is particularly strong. I think the opening to this thing, the title track, is a really nice, short, but strong opener to the project overall. It really introduces you to the sound of the project in a nice, concise manner. And from there, the project just continues on with some more great songs. I think the second track on this thing, Complicated, is one of the best on the entire record. I love the production here on this track. It's one of the songs on this thing that sounds maybe a bit more upbeat in terms of its tone, but in a way where some of the sadder feels are still present to an extent as well. It's one of those tracks where the synth line to this thing just has this kind of upbeat, happy tone to it, but when you actually dive into the lyrics of this song, they reflect a bit more darkness to it, and I quite like that. And as a whole, the production on this track is just really great. The singing here is really nice too. The lyrics are just nicely written as well. Overall, it's just a really great track. But the third song on this record, Blue World, is probably my favorite song on the entire project. Aside from Blue World, a lot of the other tracks in the first half of the record are also really entertaining as well. Tracks like Good News, and I Can See, and Everybody, for example, are just some tracks on here that I think have a lot of great things going for them, whether it be some really nicely done instrumentals that have a nice amount of soul packed into them too, some nice singing or rapping, and some really great lyrics as well. I think the first half of this project overall is one that's really great. When it comes to the second half of this project, well, I do think it is weaker than the first half. It's still pretty solid as well, I should say. Some tracks like Woods and Hands and even Hand Me Downs are some tracks I think are some of the weakest on the record overall, and they do all fall in the second half of this project. However, these tracks are still pretty good, all things considered. They still have a lot to enjoy in them, whether it be the lyrics or Mac Miller's performances themselves. Just for one reason or another, some of these tracks don't really stand out to me as being some of the most interesting. Maybe lyrically they're a bit too similar to some of the other songs on here, or maybe when it comes to the performances, they're not quite as interesting compared to some of the other tracks on this thing, but still, they're enjoyable tracks. They're not bad by any means. They are just, slightly weaker than some of the other tracks on this project. And even still, in the second half of this project, there are still some tracks that I think are really great and really worth hearing. Tracks like That's On Me, for example, which features a really catchy hook to it and some more great lyrics as well. Or the closing track to the record, Once a Day, which kind of feels like a nice parallel to the opening track of the record in the sense that both are kind of short tracks compared to a lot of the other songs on this thing. Both are some of the most simple on the entire record, but both get across a lot of the album's core ideas in a really simple and to the point manner that I really like. It feels like a very nice, concise closing to this record that I think sums things up in a really nice manner, and I love when albums are able to do that, and the fact that this is a posthumous release that obviously wasn't put together by Mac in his lifetime. It's pretty impressive that whoever was behind putting together this record took the time and effort to make this project flow together in a way that felt really natural and gave it a really proper start and conclusion. It's just really nice that they managed to do that, and it makes listening to this thing as a whole album really enjoyable. Like I said earlier, there's a lot of posthumous releases that just kind of feel like odds and ends kind of slapped together into an album for fans to just dig into, I guess, if you will. But on this project here, this feels like a proper album with a proper start and end, and a nice flow when it comes to how the tracks are laid out here. There's a concise sound to this thing, too. It consistently has that very soulful sound to it. Mac Miller singing on this thing consistently has a similar sound to it, not in the way that it's constantly sounding boring or just too samey for its own good, but similar in the sense that it makes for a very consistent listen. The lyrics here on this record are another consistently strong point of this thing, especially with how consistent they are thematically. A lot of the lyrics here talk about Mac's struggles and personal demons, which, considering how they all tie into his unfortunate passing back in 2018, it just makes this project even more hard-hitting and sad to listen to, especially when you consider the fact that he talks about his own life and death so many times here on this project. I'm not sure if he just happened to be writing a lot about this at the time, or if whoever was responsible for putting this thing together happened to focus on those lyrical themes intentionally. Either way, it made for a very consistent theme here on this record. And it's even more hard-hitting listening to this thing as a result. Overall, Circles is a pretty good record, and one of the strongest posthumous releases I've heard from an artist in quite a long time. Again, I know I've said it quite a lot at this point, but whoever was responsible for putting this thing together clearly had a lot of care for what was going on here on this thing, as the end result ended up being pretty, not only good, but pretty consistent when it comes to being an album experience as well. This is definitely a project I could see myself returning to and wanting to listen to as a whole thing, and not just individual tracks here or there. And I think that fans of Mac Miller will certainly appreciate that. And considering the album's been out for a couple months at this point, I'm sure that those fans have already been appreciating that fact for the past couple months or so. But for whatever reason, if you haven't heard this album yet, you should certainly give it a listen. I think it's a pretty solid release. Not one of the greatest ever or anything, but as far as posthumous projects go, this is pretty high up there, and it's worth giving a listen to. Even though I wasn't really familiar with Mac Miller's music prior to listening to this thing, I feel like I'm certainly going to be giving some of his other albums a listen sometime in the near future, just because I enjoyed this one quite a bit, and it's a shame that he passed away when he did, because this is enjoyable music, and I wish he had a chance to make some more. So yeah, rest in peace, Mac Miller. Enjoy this project, guys, because it's pretty good. Next up, I want to be talking about the newest record from Spanish Love Songs, Brave Faces Everyone. I decided to check out this record because of the incredible amount of praise it was receiving online following its release. Even though I never heard of these guys before, with a lot of other people here on YouTube and other parts of the internet saying that this was one of the best records of the year so far, I just knew I had to check this thing out. And after listening to it a good few times now, all the hype was certainly deserved. This thing really is that great, and I would be really surprised if it didn't make my best of the year list come December next year. It's that great overall. Spanish Love Songs have this very emotive style of pop-punk music, and while pop-punk is a genre that over the past few years or so I haven't been as interested in, especially when it comes to newer acts, I feel like this group really gets everything right with the genre here on this release. When it comes to the instrumentals here on this thing, they are very, straightforward. They are very to the point, like a lot of pop-punk music is, but there's a lot of detail packed into it as well, and all the performances here are so energetic too. It just makes for just really fantastic music. All the riffs on this thing are really memorable. The bass lines are very prominent and memorable as well. The drum work here on this thing is very hard-hitting, and it lays a nice groundwork for everything else here in the songs to work with, really. And the vocals on this thing are fantastic too. When it comes to pop-punk vocals, they can be kind of hit or miss for me, honestly, especially when it comes to them being really nasally or whiny at times. Those things can be a really big turn-off for me when it comes to pop-punk. And here on this project, the vocals, fortunately, do not have any of those aspects to them. They're really powerful at times, very emotive, but they also have this very fragile quality to them as well, where it feels like the vocalist here is just very close to just, breaking apart, really, when it comes to how sad and depressed and anxious a lot of the lyrics on this thing are. And when it actually does come to the lyrics here on this thing, they are another aspect of this record that are just really fantastic. Essentially, the lyrics here on this record embody what it's like living as a millennial or an older Gen Z person in this current day and age, and a lot of the problems that come along with it. And while I can't necessarily relate to every single issue here on this record, even though I fit into that demographic, I definitely know that there's a lot of other people around me, people I'm friends with, that deal with these problems all the time. And of course, there are certainly aspects of this record that I do personally relate to quite a lot. There's a lot of just really relatable stuff being talked about here on this record. And it's presented in such an upfront and honest manner. Not like it's trying too hard, not like it's just trying to appeal to people in any way possible. It just feels so incredibly earnest that it just ends up working so nicely. The group talks about things like poverty, and at times how it feels almost like it's better to just die than have to deal with what comes along with that. They talk about things like anxiety, things like depression, dealing with drug addiction, not only when it comes to these problems affecting the narrator of these tracks, but also when it comes to how they affect the other people in their lives, their friends, their family. When it comes to things like unemployment, they talk about that as well. They just really capture everything here. That general anxious, uncertain feeling that I think so many people within this age bracket really just identify with greatly. It's perfectly captured here in the lyrics and sound of this project. And again, to go back to the vocals here on this thing, the way that all these lyrics are delivered here on this project just makes them so much more powerful, because again, the kind of powerful vocal delivery here on these tracks make the vocalist really determined in his delivery of what's being said here. It all feels so genuine, but at the same time, the kind of fragile nature of them at the same time just lets you know that even though this person, this narrator of this track, is very much passionate about what they're singing about, they're just so close to losing it all, possibly, because that's just the reality a lot of people have to live with. The hooks here on this record are another aspect of this project that I really like too, especially given how catchy they are, especially on songs like both the Losers tracks on this thing, or Routine Pain, or Generation Loss. These are songs that are just really memorable because of their hooks, aside from everything else that makes them really stand out and memorable too. It just seems like here on this project, these guys get everything about this kind of pop punk just perfectly right. The hooks are all there, the lyrics are there, the instrumentals are there. It just comes together perfectly. As far as complaints go with this thing, I don't really have many. The little that I have, they're not really major complaints. I do think that maybe some of the instrumentals in the second half of this project could be a bit more unique compared to some of the other ones on this thing, but that's a very, very minor complaint with this project. All the instrumentals on this thing are still really, really good overall. And not really a complaint I have with this thing, but just a general warning almost, I guess. But if this kind of lyrical subject matter kind of just gets you even more anxious or depressed or what have you, then maybe this will be a bit of a tiring listen for you, and I can't necessarily see that being everyone's cup of tea as a result of it. Like, if these kind of lyrics maybe will make you more upset, I could see why you wouldn't like this project as much as everyone else who maybe finds it a bit cathartic would. But that's not really a complaint I have with this project. It's more so just, again, maybe a general warning or statement or whatever you want to call it, I guess. But that's just because of how great the lyrics on this record are, almost. Just how relatable and honest and just upfront they are a lot of the times on this thing. And that's something that, at least for me personally, I really liked about this record. But of course, if for whatever reason you happen to not, enjoy them as much for that reason, if it just makes you feel even more anxious than you're already feeling in this world, perfectly understandable. At least I think it's perfectly understandable. But yeah, overall, I think this record is just really great overall. I think as far as pop punk releases go, this is the first time I felt this excited about a new pop punk release in quite a while. And if you're a fan of this kind of music, or even if you're not really a fan of this kind of music, I could certainly see you enjoying this project too, just given how perfectly everything is executed here on this record. Overall, the hype is certainly deserved for this thing. Give it a listen for sure. Moving on though, let's talk about the newest record from Ozzy Osbourne, Ordinary Man. I wasn't really sure what to expect from this project. While I'm a big fan of Black Sabbath and a lot of Ozzy's classic albums, I haven't really kept up to date with a lot of his solo releases. And I know it's been quite a while since he's had a solo release, but still, a lot of his more recent ones I hadn't really heard, so I kind of came into this one a bit blind in that regard. And overall, I think that Ordinary Man is a pretty acceptable release from Ozzy at this point in his career. It's not a bad album, but at the same time, it's not an album that blew me away necessarily. It's pretty standard fare from him at this point in his career, I guess. It's not the greatest thing in the world, it's just pretty fine, I guess. Overall, the songs on this thing just see Ozzy doing a pretty straightforward heavy metal approach to things, with lyrics that oftentimes have a kind of spooky, in a kind of, campy sort of way. It's just your typical heavy metal stuff, I guess, would be the best way to put it. The album starts off somewhat strongly, I feel, with the track Straight to Hell, which is probably one of the most straightforward cuts on the entire record. However, it's probably one of the most fun cuts on this thing as well. Ozzy sounds like he's having quite a bit of fun here on this track. It's just a pretty straightforward, fun song, I guess. Nothing groundbreaking or anything like that. Just fun, I guess. The track Ordinary Man on this thing, the title track that features Elton John, is another one of the highlights on this thing, too. Not groundbreaking again, but still a pretty solid track, and this collaboration I think works out pretty nicely too. The song Under the Graveyard is another one of the best tracks on this thing too, probably my favorite song on this thing overall. A bit of a slower track, but also a track that brings some heaviness to this album too, with some of the riffs here on this thing that I quite like. Again, not a song that's groundbreaking or anything along those lines, but just a solid, enjoyable heavy metal track. Overall, my biggest complaint with this project is just that a lot of the tracks on here aren't exactly the most memorable. Again, some of the tracks I just listed were some of the best on this thing because for one reason or another they have some aspect to them that makes them kind of stand out, but a lot of the tracks here just feel maybe a bit too typical for their own good, especially towards the final half of this project. I feel like some of the cuts that you get there are just a bit too typical overall. Tracks like Eat Me, and Scary Little Green Men, and Holy for Tonight, for example. These tracks aren't, terrible or anything. They're perfectly listenable songs, but they don't exactly bring enough new to the table to keep me all that entertained. Ozzy's vocals here on this record also aren't necessarily in the greatest shape that they could be in, I guess, though, of course, that's not really his own fault as much as it is the fault of just aging. So it's not really something I can complain a ton about, I guess, but on some of the tracks here, his vocals are maybe a little bit rougher than I would like, and the production here on this album is another aspect of this thing that certainly doesn't help with this, because the production at times on this thing can be kind of wonky in the sense that the mixing of sounds isn't necessarily the greatest. Certain tracks feel oddly mixed when it comes to the instrumentals being louder than the vocals, or Ozzy's vocals just sounding a bit more processed than they should. The track that suffers from this the most, in my opinion, is the closing track to the record. It's a Raid featuring Post Malone, a collaboration that I thought was kind of odd at first. I know that they had a collaboration on Post's last album, which actually appears as a bonus track on this project, but hearing Post on a Ozzy Osbourne project proper was kind of unexpected, but I actually think the two have decent chemistry here on this song. And the fact that it's the heaviest, most energetic track on the record, I don't think will end up disappointing long-term fans who maybe were a bit hesitant listening to a track with a modern hip-hop artist on it. But it works out pretty nicely when it comes to their collaboration. I think that Ozzy's performance here on this track is really energetic. I love the energy of this song. It's just that the production here on this track is not good at all, really. It's just way too loud, way too boisterous. It reminds me a lot of the production on Baroness's last record, but not quite as bad. But it's the same kind of bad, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. It just makes the track kind of annoying to listen to, which is a bit of a shame because, like I said, I think stylistically it's one of the more unique tracks on this thing. I think Ozzy's performance on the track is one of the best on this thing, and the fact that the collaboration is so odd but it ends up working as nicely as it does, it's just kind of disappointing that it wasn't on a track that sounded a little bit better. Honestly, it didn't surprise me when I did some additional research on this album and found out the producers of this project are primarily known for producing pop music and hip-hop, and just not metal at all. In fact, the heaviest music that any of the producers for this thing were involved with prior to this project was the last Blink-182 record, which still isn't a particularly heavy project. So, yeah, I can kind of understand how the production here ended up as awkward as it did, unfortunately. Overall, Ordinary Man is just a pretty typical project from Ozzy at this point in his career. Again, there are some moments on this thing that I think are pretty enjoyable, and I don't think there are any tracks on this thing that are like outright bad necessarily, but at the same time, a good amount of this project just ends up being a bit too forgettable for its own good, to the point where I'm not sure this is a project I'll be super interested in returning to in the future, just because I think there's a lot of other projects out there that do what this album does, but better. If you're an Ozzy fan, this is certainly a project that I think you might get at least some enjoyment out of, but if you haven't really been keeping up with his music as of late, because maybe it just hasn't interested you as of late, I don't think this project is necessarily going to change your mind, because it's pretty standard heavy metal. Not too much about it that's super interesting. It just so happens to be coming from one of the most legendary people within all of metal music. But yeah, it doesn't necessarily make it all that much more interesting. It's just pretty standard, I guess. There's worse things out there, but there's certainly better things too. And with that said, that concludes today's catch-up review. If you happen to have any different opinions than my own on any of these projects, that's perfectly fine. In fact, feel free to leave your own thoughts on these projects in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, make sure you also leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content. Things like album reviews, more list videos, things of that sort. If you enjoy that kind of content, make sure you subscribe. Thank you for watching once again, and stay golden.